Hello everyone, and welcome to our first and as yet unnamed podcast. My name is Rosa, and I run a subgroup looking at all the issues that the WI has campaigned on over the last 100 years. One of the WI's current key campaigns focuses on mental health, and I was excited to take advantage of this to talk about women and autism. I haven't said this publicly before, but several years ago I was diagnosed with autism. It explained so much to me about myself and the problems that I've had all my life. I told my autistic friends, some of whom said that they were surprised that I hadn't known I was autistic already, but I stopped telling my non-autistic friends pretty quickly because there was so much misinformation and so many stereotypes. I thought that the diagnosis of autism would bring clarity, but instead it triggered a lot of confusion as my non-autistic friends struggled to relate the caricatures that they'd seen on popular TV programs and films to me, a real person. So when I saw that April was host to Autism Awareness Day and also happens to be the month of my autism birthday, I thought, brilliant, I will shift the responsibility. And I was lucky enough for that person to be Laura James. Laura James is a journalist and the author of Odd Girl Out, which explores her late diagnosis of autism. So many people have told me that her book changed how they felt about their own autism, and I was so excited to talk to her. I began by asking her why she wrote her book and who her book was for.
So two things happened. The first thing is most adults who get an autism diagnosis suspect that they're autistic before they go along for the assessment. And that's how you kind of get the assessment. And so before I booked an assessment, I looked around to try and find books by people like me. And I couldn't find them. I found a lot of books by parents of autistic kids. I found a lot of books by professionals, and I found a lot of books by men, but I couldn't find any books by autistic women, really. Particularly women who'd kind of raised children, had a career, all of those things. So that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book. But also I'm a journalist, and there is this kind of life is copy thing. And so anytime anything happens in the life of somebody who writes for a living, you do find yourself thinking, will I write about this? How will I write about this? When will I write about this? So it was kind of always an inevitability, I think.
And do you find much has changed since you've written it in terms of understanding?
One of the really great things. So I was really lucky that my book was very successful and it got an awful lot of media attention because it was really the first memoir that was published in the UK by a mainstream publisher by an autistic woman. And since then, lots of other books are coming out. So brilliant Sarah Gibbs, who you probably know on Twitter, she's got a book coming out. A couple of American women have books coming out. Catherine May, who just wrote the very successful book Wintering, her previous book was a book on being an adult woman diagnosed with autism. So I think one of the big things that has changed and that I'm really thrilled about is that all of these other books have come out, because there's this saying, I'm sure you've heard, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and all of our experiences are different. So it's been really great to have all of these voices talking about the same subject but differently.
So with that said, given it is so individual, how do you explain what it is to people?
That's a really interesting one. So it's different for different people, really. But I think for me, it's simply like just having your brain wired differently.
Oh, I think she's frozen. Hopefully she'll be back in just a minute. Okay, maybe her internet connection has well and truly gone. Okay, we'll hang on and see if she comes back in a second. Okay, so maybe I'll use this to talk about my own experience and just kind of keep it going while we're waiting for her to come back. Yes, talking about autism and how wide and individual it is, it's one of the things that makes it so hard to tell people that you have it, because when I was young, I had this kind of same impressions of autism as everybody else, that it was a kind of extreme condition. And, the kind of person I pictured was usually someone who had a learning disability. And learning disabilities are more common among autistic people, but they're not the same. And so you can be of average intelligence or even high intelligence and be autistic. But my impression was that, autism and learning disabilities were kind of one and the same thing. So eventually, when I started to meet people who were autistic, I kind of blew my mind in a little way, and I realized, I had completely the wrong impression, and that there was much more to it. I don't know how many people here actually are autistic. If you want to give a wave, if you are, quite a few hands waving. It'll be interesting to hear like what your experience of autism was like before you realized what it was. But I found out what it was after talking to a friend who was telling me about her anxiety and how that kind of manifested in very particular ways for her. So my mum is actually on the call right now, and I'm sure she would tell you about how, from childhood, even things like walking down the street where there was buses and cars, and I couldn't cope well with it at all. The amount of encouragement she'd have to give me sometimes just to like walk to the corner shop with her, or to go into a shop, was something we kind of got used to, and we just thought it was like me being sensitive and my personality. And to realize that these problems sort of fell within a tribe almost. I'm going to use that word, because it isn't just like a disorder, but a collection of traits that a lot of people have, and isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's bad when it's triggered, but we're not the problem. It's like the sensory assault that is the problem. It was amazing to find out that these things had a name, and I suddenly made sense to myself in a way that I didn't before. I didn't understand why I wasn't like other people, or why I couldn't get on with things like other people could get on with things. I don't know if Laura is back yet. Oh yes, I think I can see you moving. Hi. So I don't know where we lost you, but I was just giving a bit of background about how I was as a kid and my misconceptions of autism, and realizing what it was, and then realizing other people did not know what it was. They still had the impression that I had when I was growing up of it being this intellectual disability, as opposed to how would you describe it?
So I think you're right. I think very often people with autism do also have a learning disability, and I think that's kind of the impression we've got. And really, until Rain Man, people didn't really know about autism. It was one of those things that just wasn't talked about. And the person who Rain Man was about wasn't even autistic, so the whole thing is quite muddied. And I also think we had a very stereotypical white young male, kind of in dodgy jumpers, or scientific guy with his hair all over the place who could do amazing things like with physics but couldn't make a cheese sandwich, kind of thing. I think that's the kind of view that we had of autism. So when it was raised with me, I realized that first of all, I didn't really know what it was. But secondly, I kind of thought it was somebody who was incredibly shy, and somebody who couldn't make conversation, and I communicate for a living. It's how I make my money. So I found it very difficult to believe about myself, and I think that stereotype has been really damaging to people, particularly women or non-binary people, who don't fit that very kind of stereotypical view that the world has of it. I was asked to describe it. I think it's like having a different operating system, not a better one, not a worse one. So it's like the difference between being a Mac or a PC, or a cat or a dog or whatever. And if you have a PC and you try and load a Mac package onto it, like you try and load Mac-based Photoshop onto it, it's not going to work. But it doesn't mean that the computer's wrong or the software's wrong. It just means that they're not compatible. Or if you send a cat out to retrieve a pheasant in the field when it's just been shot, rather than a Labrador, the cat's not going to go and it's not going to work. It doesn't mean that the cat's not great at catching mice or whatever. And so for me, I think the way that I would describe it in one sentence is autistic people have a different operating system. We experience the world differently, and we relate to the world differently, but not less, not as well. just it is harder for us in some respects and easier for us in others.
I don't fit the savant stereotype, but I have to hold my hands up for the dodgy jumper stereotype.
Yeah.
I do not like shopping. My jumpers are dodgy and old.
Yeah, well, I don't like shopping either. I really hate shopping, and I like very plain things. And I think, yeah, but yeah, I don't care that much about clothes. But I care way more about clothes than the stereotypical, kind of autistic sciencey boy, really.
What is so you mentioned about boys quite a lot. What it's quite hard to sort of phrase the question without giving the impression that there is boy autism and girl autism, because that is not the case. But they do present kind of differently. Could you talk a bit about that?
So I think that I think that there are different kinds of autism, and they don't necessarily always kind of match to a girl or match to a boy. But when you read any of the medical literature about autism, it'll ask questions that will relate to a way that a girl isn't generally raised. So we're socialized. I mean, it's getting much better now, but generally, certainly when I was growing up, there were girl toys and there were boy toys. So, and one of the questions is, do they line up their trains? Well, I didn't have trains. I mean, I would have loved a train set, frankly, and I'd have loved to have lined it up, but I never got that. So I was given things like dolls. And if somebody were observing me with the dolls, they might not, the subtle differences in the way that the things I would have done with them would not necessarily show. So with me, I didn't love dolls particularly. I did quite like the dolls' clothes and folding them and almost filing them in the wardrobe and organizing everything and having it all very kind of sort of perfect. But then I didn't do that thing that other girls would do, where they'd kind of have their Barbie doll and they'd have their Ken doll and they'd get married and they'd have fights and they'd have a baby, and they just didn't do any of that. I just did the tidying up their house kind of thing. But I think that's harder for somebody observing, when they do autism assessments. I think it's harder for somebody observing that than it is if you just see, you have something quite square like trains that you'll watch somebody lining up. So I think that's slightly problematic. And also little girls often have real special interests. So, you will find neurotypical girls who are really interested in ponies or interested in a boy band or interested in whatever it is. But what you'll find with the autistic girl is that her knowledge is much, much greater. So it might be that all the girls in her class collected My Little Pony, but she would know the history of My Little Pony. She would be able to tell you, why this little pony's mane was slightly different to this one and what production line it came off or whatever. But those things I think are harder for parents and physicians to pick up. So yeah. And also I think that there is this myth that all autistic people are incredibly shy or incredibly introverted. And I don't think that's true. But I think what happens is that it's that the way that boys and girls and are raised, we are raised to be either a girl or a boy generally, and we're socialized to behave in a certain way. So I think what often happens is if you're raised to be a boy and you're autistic and you're frustrated and you're overloaded in a sensory fashion and all of those kinds of things, you'll kind of push it outwards, and your behavior will be such that people will describe it as problematic, but you'll be pushing all of that kind of discomfort outwards. Whereas I think with girls or those who are raised to be girls, I think we're socialized to internalize that pain and that discomfort, and so we'll kind of turn it in on ourselves. So I think often you'll find that in an effort to control things, you'll develop some kind of disordered eating, or you'll kind of become anxious or depressed or whatever, because you're not kind of throwing it all out there. And I think that's a really big problem.
I saw a talk by Sarah Hendricks. She's a researcher in autism, and she said how she thinks a lot of men and boys cope with autism by saying no to things, that girls and women cope by saying yes and trying to please. So when men and boys say no, people will try and accommodate them and change things, and it becomes a bit more noticeable as well if someone is saying no and other people are trying to include them. But if person automatically says yes and then silently panics, that can go unnoticed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that there is something, for me at least, and I can't generalize about kind of autism or women or whatever. I can just talk about my experience and the experience of many women I've met. And for me, I really distinctly remember being around 5, being in the playground, watching the girls doing all the things they were doing. They were playing with dolls, they were pretending to be Charlie's Angels, they were doing all sorts of things. And I just looked at them and thought, I'm just not the same as you. And I remember thinking very clearly, I'm not the same as you. And then my next thought was, but I need to pretend to be, because it's important. And I didn't know why, and I wasn't old enough to articulate those thoughts. But I guess looking back on it, it was needing a feeling of safety, and that safety was fitting in, which I think is important for girls. Because often at school they are quite in quite groups. They're quite grouped. Sorry about that, by the way.
I was a big fan of nature documentaries and animals, and I thought at school I remember looking at the other kids as through almost the lens of the nature documentary, and that I would study them and copy them. And I had one friend in particular who I just latched onto, and she was my safety friend who I would just follow around.
Yeah. And I think that, yeah, there's definitely that. And I think you kind of have, you sort of model this girl. When I was at school, there was a girl who was a few years above me, and she had the word Elvis written on her plimsolls. And I didn't know who Elvis was, but I called her, in my head, she was the Elvis girl. And when anything happened, I'd think, well, what would the Elvis girl do? I cut my hair. When she got a new jumper, I would want to wear a jumper of that color. If she, anything she did, I copied, because she just seemed to be this sort of this paragon of what one should be.
Yeah, well, we started this by saying, how different autistic people are different, and we're so different. Of course we're individuals, we're different, but there's so many things in your book that you wrote where I feel were kind of plucked from my life. Whether so many things, it's almost like hard to pick. But so if we talk about feelings, for example, like leading up to this conversation, I was feeling really excited to talk to you, and the last 2 weeks I had told my boyfriend that I hate feeling excited, like just very flat out, I hate it because it's too stimulating, and I don't deal with strong emotions, whether they're positive or negative. And I find it really remarkable just how similar autistic people are and how different at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I talk about there being like kind of 3 feelings: the good feeling, the bad feeling, and the neutral feeling. And sometimes the volume of those feelings gets turned up. So I would like to live my life in neutral. Just don't want anything much to happen. Just want everything to feel quite soft and quite nice. If somebody said to me, I know you can win the lottery tomorrow and you can have a Ferrari and and you can fall madly in love with kind of Brad Pitt and he'll come around. I just no, really, I just want to know that I'm going to get a nice supper tonight, and I just want to know that it's going to be quiet and that my sheets aren't going to be scratchy, and that everything's just going to be kind of quite calm. But then I find in that way that way of being human that I don't manage to ever live like that. So obviously there are the ups and downs of life, and I do have a job where often exciting things happen. I just don't process them in the same way as other people do. So I do a lot of celebrity interviews, for example, and people get really excited about it, and I'm just like, oh, but I have to go to Hampshire, and Hampshire's like 200 miles away, and I don't think where I'm going to have my lunch, and and what am I going to do about like ridiculous things that other people just wouldn't think about? And well, I won't be home until 9:30, which means that I'll miss having my bath at 8:30, and but I think that one of the things that I did in therapy that I wrote about was I kind of was given a feelings wheel where you have to kind of colour in the different feelings you're feeling. And that did help me in many ways to kind of unravel what emotions are. But still, I would rather be in the neutral.
Like, you start your book by talking about emotions, and that also for me was my kind of aha moment, or the beginning of the aha was I spent hours and hours for months like reading about emotions, like on Wikipedia, on various websites, like how do you feel them, how do you know you're having them, how other people, what do they look like, what do they feel like, and I mentioned this to a friend and she said, oh, that's a bit strange. And she said, do you think you might be autistic? And I said, no, because I didn't really know what it was. And she asked me, look it up, because that I think the theme seems to be that autistic people, just the world is overwhelming, and that often gets attributed to just our personalities, but it's the ways that we find it overwhelming, and how common that overwhelm is. It's not that something happened to us, like PTSD or like a trauma. It's that different processing, like you said. Like, we have our personalities, and if you attribute autism to a personality, nobody's going to seem autistic, because autistic isn't a personality.
Absolutely, that's so true. And I think that's a really, really good point. And also, if you raised a child, an autistic child, in the perfect environment for that child, whatever their perfect environment was, for me, it would be pink and soft and fluffy. And you didn't make them go to school, and they could eat whatever they wanted whenever they wanted to eat it, and it would always be available. And you made this perfect world, then all of the things that we talk about as autistic traits you'd never see them. There would never be a meltdown, because everything would be just so. And that, so I think you're right. And also, I think it's complicated, because we have these labels, these descriptions of neurodiversities, but often I think they're quite overlapping. So most people I know who are autistic also would probably qualify for an ADHD diagnosis. I know that I certainly would.
Yes, I have that as a diagnosis as well.
Yeah, and so then you get that kind of thing. I just noticed something pop up in the comments, which made me think about it. Then you get that thing where there is that conflict. So my autism makes me want to do something absolutely perfectly, and my ADHD traits mean that I will sit there for 5 hours not doing that thing, which means that it won't be perfect. Whereas a neurotypical person would sit there and just do their best, and that would be it. They would be done way earlier.
It's a very all or nothing, like you swing from one to the other.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned environment, because I just got up on my Kindle, actually. I highlighted a quote from your book, and I thought this is like the important thing. So you said the importance of environment is so important to autistic people, and we need to stop trying to be less autistic and start creating environments in which we can thrive.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I've been really lucky. And one of the questions that I get asked a lot, and also, to be fair, one of the criticisms that I get leveled at me a lot, generally from men, it has to be said, is that why do I need a diagnosis? How can I be autistic when I'm successful? But the reason I'm successful at my job is I'm one of those incredibly lucky people. And I realize this has changed for everybody over the last year, because many of us can now do this. But I've always been able to work at home in my pajamas, eating what I want to eat when I want to eat it, and behaving however I want to behave. And that is just a sheer stroke of luck that I managed to become a writer, and that's what I do. But I think that I'm really hopeful that now that the world has moved on to home working, that many more autistic people will be able to find their niche, but actually just be able to do it in an environment which often is a home environment, which will suit them way better than going into an office.
So that was quite an interesting thing that you said, that I just want to kind of go back to and delve a bit deeper. Like, if we are just different, and I'm just devil's advocate, if we are just different, why do we need a diagnosis? Why does anyone need a diagnosis? Can't we just be different?
I think it's a really good question. And I think it depends on your life stage. So I think that if I had, so I don't have any exams at all. I don't have any GCSEs. I didn't go to college. I didn't go to university. I utterly failed at school and was miserable every single day of my education. And had a diagnosis been available for me when I was a child, and the kind of supports that are available now, albeit patchily, then my academic life would have been very different. And I think that would have been of benefit to me. The reason I got diagnosed in my 40s was for a couple of reasons. One, because once it was raised with me, I was like a dog with a bone. I just couldn't let it go. I just needed to know. I needed a professional to either say yes or no to me. And also because as a writer, I knew I was going to write about the subject, and I didn't feel confident and comfortable writing about a subject without a professional diagnosis. Because what if I was wrong? What if I was wrong and I wrote this book and I said all this stuff, and that could affect the lives of, you know, loads of different people. So that's why it was important for me. But I also think, but I also really believe that self-diagnosis is very valid too. And often people don't have the ability or the means or whatever to get a diagnosis. And so I think having these words like autism or ADHD or whatever means that you can find your tribe. And that, I think, is really important because, you know, the diagnosis process was interesting, and I learned a lot about myself and a lot about autism. And the specialist therapy I had afterwards was very helpful in helping me put some routines and things in place. But by and large, the best thing that's happened to me is finding this tribe of people who I totally relate to, which is something I would never have had before. And without those labels, we wouldn't find that community.
That's very true. I remember when I was diagnosed, it wasn't so much that I found out that I was different. I found that I was the same as these other people.
Exactly that. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I thought I would bring up some questions or statements really that other people have said to me, you know, when I've told them that I was autistic. So I only told about 2 or 3 people before I thought, oh, I think I might back off telling non-autistic people for a while. But so I thought I'll put these to you, see how you respond. So the classic, of course, you don't seem autistic.
Yeah, I know, that's really great. And somebody told me once on Twitter, which is great, and I think it's amazing t-shirt, someone said, you know, to her, you don't look autistic, and she's like, and you don't look stupid, but still here we are, kind of thing. and it is true. I mean, there is no look. It really, there is no look. And I think that is something that is starting to come out. I think with social media, I think that's been a real help because people see people's profile pictures and realize that, yeah, we're all really different. So
yeah, and I think people expect to get a diagnosis, you need to be absolutely devastated by it, which is quite an ableist way to look at it. Like you don't need to wait to get to that point before you start diagnosing people as well.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that so I got my diagnosis in quite a weird way. I'll really tell you really quickly. I had some physical health problems. I'd had some really weird health problems over my lifetime that doctors could never quite explain. I got misdiagnosed with all sorts of physical illnesses. And my personal favorite is just bad luck. But eventually I got a diagnosis of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which often comes with autism. And I was in hospital having some tests and for something called POTS, which often comes alongside EDS. And I was in this hospital. It's really, really, it was the hottest day of the year. The air conditioning had broken. I had this tilt table test where it's like torture. They strap you to a table.
Yes, I call it the torture table test. I have had one.
They do terrible things to you. And you're not allowed to eat. And one of my real triggers is kind of hunger. So, and I was told that after the test, I would go back to my room. There would be a tuna sandwich waiting. The air conditioning would be working. I'd be able to sit quietly. Got to my room. The air conditioning was broken. There was a screaming child in the room next door. There was no tuna sandwich, no glass of water. And I just exploded and had a meltdown. And that's happened to me in a hospital setting numerous times. And every single time they thought that I was like a stuck-up, princessy, really entitled, horrible person. But this nurse didn't roll her eyes, tut and walk out. She sat down on the bed next to me and kind of put her arm around my shoulder and was just like, we've really failed you here. We see loads of autistic people and we should have realized that, you know, that these things should have been in place for you. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't really know what autism is, but I know I'm not autistic. But if it gets me a tuna fish sandwich, then I'll go with it. So so I nodded and nodded. And I had to stay overnight. And I kind of thought, and as I was sort of sitting in my room, you know, how bored you are in hospital, after the sandwich, and I was feeling better, I just kind of thought, well, I don't really know what autism is. I don't really understand it. I'll Google it. And I Googled it and thought, yeah, well, I do that and I do that. And then I Googled autistic women and suddenly it was just like kind of coming home. I read all of these kind of first person accounts and all of these lists of different traits. And I was literally just ticking boxes from everything from, you know, preferring comfortable clothes to, you know, the way that I related to my peers in childhood and everything. And then when I came home from hospital, a couple of days later, I was walking on the beach with my husband and I'm like, I think I'm autistic. And he's like, no, you're not, don't be ridiculous. And I'm like, no, really, I think I am. And he's just like, really? And another diagnosis, do we really need this? So I kind of didn't think about it for a little while. But then it just niggled at me. And I just found myself obsessively Googling. And that's why I decided I need
to. You have to know.
Yeah.
I had that kind of another diagnosis feeling as well. Like I was almost embarrassed to have this extra thing.
Yeah, and there is that kind of slight embarrassment. And yeah, and I was misdiagnosed with something called hyperventilation syndrome when I was in my late teens, and I was given tranquilizers that I didn't realize were tranquilizers, and I ended up in rehab, and it was all really awful. And in rehab, one of the kind of the things that you hear a lot is everyone here thinks they're special and different. You're not special and different. And so to suddenly then start collecting all of these sort of 3-letter diagnoses, and you suddenly feel like, well, I know I'm not special, but, you know, I am a bit different. And it's quite difficult to reconcile that. It's quite difficult not to just keep going. But when I got my EDS and POTS diagnoses at the same time, so did my son. And that, I think, made it feel easier for me, the fact that I was doing the right thing as a mother. So, because I think sometimes we're quite harsh on ourselves, but we wouldn't be harsh on our friends or our children or whoever. And yeah.
Yes, the getting it as an addition was both kind of both embarrassing. So I sort of felt like, oh, now my personality has a diagnosis, but also all these struggles that I had put down. And you know, I was talking to my mum earlier, and we'd kind of bundled everything up into like, you're overwhelmed because you're physically overwhelmed, you're overwhelmed because of, you know, chronic pain or chronic fatigue or all this kind of thing, and be able to separate out and you know, recognize, okay, these are problems that might go away one day, and these are problems we have to live with and accept and not fight.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And also sometimes I think that you just have to accept that stuff happens to you. So I'm going, stuff happens to my body and I don't know what it is or why it is. But just weird things happen to me. So tomorrow I'm going to have an operation because I had a Marina coil fitted about 18 months ago. And it transpires that it's gone wandering, and it's wandered kind of through my womb and is currently heading somewhere towards my liver, I think. And that is really rare that happens to people, but it's, you know, I've got a perforated uterus and that has happened to me. And I think that when you can see something on a scan like that, then I think it's easier to accept that it's real than hearing this thing where you kind of always question yourself. And with POTS, I know if I stand up, my heart rate will raise. I know it will raise more than 30 beats per minute. I know that it will stay like that. And I know that doesn't happen to other people. But still, I kind of just feel like, oh, well, you know, am I just making a fuss? So I totally get what you mean.
So that brings me to my other point that someone asked me is, how do you know it isn't anxiety?
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting. And I've thought a lot about that as well. And for me, I think the way that I reconciled that is the things that make other people anxious don't make me anxious. So I'm not anxious standing up in front of a room full of people and talking. I'm not anxious about doing TV. I'm not anxious about interviewing celebrities. I'm not anxious about writing a book and having it out there. I'm not, those things that would make people kind of, would usually be an anxiety provoking thing, don't make me feel anxious. Not being able to find the scarf that I need to wear to go on the train does make me anxious, because I know that it will be a sensory nightmare if I can't wrap it around my face and all the smells will be there or whatever. Not being able to find my noise cancelling AirPods would make me anxious. And so I think that, I think, and also whenever I read about people's accounts of anxiety, like generalized anxiety disorder or whatever, it just doesn't fit me. So that's how I have kind of, I broke down the things that made me anxious, and I realized that by and large they're all environmental, they're all sensory.
Yeah, I remember when I was sent to have CBT for my physical conditions, the therapist, she was trying to find out what it was about things that I was anxious about. Like, what was the thought? What did I think would happen if something was too noisy or too cold or too bright? And it's the additional thing of this. I think with anxiety, you think that means something additionally, whereas for us it is just the very fact of it.
That's it. So it would be things like, I would feel anxious if I had to go to a pub with a whole group of people and sit there all evening at a table. I mean, I realize that nobody does this anymore, but when we used to do this, then that would make me really, really anxious. And when I've done CBT in the past and things, they'd be like, would you be worrying about what they were thinking about you? And I'd be like, no.
Yeah.
Would you be worrying that you kind of weren't part of it and things? I'd be like, no. I'd be worried that the food wouldn't be what I wanted it to be. And I'd be worried that I'd be sitting near a loo where you could hear the hand dryer. And I'd be worried about the music being too loud. And I'd be worried about just the exhaustion I feel when you have that, just kind of all of that noise around you.
Yeah.
And I think until my diagnosis, I don't think the therapists either quite believed me or could quite understand the difference.
Okay, another thing. So I've got a little list. We'll go down it. I think I've got 5. But you're so nice.
Yeah, I think people, do you mean that when you tell people that you're autistic, they're like, but you're so nice?
Yeah, you're nice. I like talking to you. You don't make me feel weird or awkward.
I think there is this horrible stereotype that autistic people are incredibly rude. And I think that comes from kind of cultural references, because we are quite often quite honest. And I think it's quite an interesting one, because we live in a culture where we lie to people every single day. And when I met my husband, he'd been married before, and I would say to him things like, "Do these jeans suit me?" And he'd say yes. And I'd go, "I don't really think they do, I think they make this stereotypically, I think they make my bum look big, or I'm just not sure the colour's right, or I don't think this dress works, or what about this haircut," or whatever. And he would lie to me every single time. And one day I said to him, "I think you're lying to me." And he said, "Well, yeah, because I don't want to tell you that the jeans aren't nice." And I'm like, "I'd rather, in the comfort and privacy of our own home, you tell me that the jeans aren't great than you send me out into the world with everyone going, 'Oh, look at the jeans on her.'" So I think that there is, so I think that autistic people are able to be more honest about that. And if a friend came round and said, "Do you like this dress?" I would say, "I don't think it suits you. I don't." And I think that becomes people thinking that we're kind of not nice, where actually we're just being honest. And I think it is more helpful to be able, I mean, obviously on someone's wedding day, if they waft down the aisle and they say, "Do you like my dress?" Even if they are wearing the most hideous dress, and as of course I would lie and say it was the most marvelous thing I'd ever seen. But in those other exchanges where the stakes aren't so high, I think that people imagine that we're horrible because we are able to be more honest in a way.
Yeah, I remember once I bought this jacket, and my boyfriend, he had a friend round, and I put the jacket on in front of them both and said to him, "What do you think?" And he said, "No, the color makes you look really tired and like you look a weird shape." And his friend was horrified, but I just thought, thanks, that I've saved £50 or however much it was.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. But even now my husband feels that he has to sugarcoat stuff, and really I just want like total bluntness.
Okay, so me being diagnosed, I got one response. "I guess that proves that everyone is a bit autistic and on the spectrum somewhere."
So it's a really annoying one. So the thing is, all autistic traits are human traits. We don't have any alien traits or cat traits or whatever. We're all human.
We have a few cat traits.
Just a few. But, you know, so anything that we experience is part of the human experience. So we just process it differently and experience the world differently. And we're all just a bit autistic. I mean, a doctor, one of my EDS doctors said that to me, and it was really, really annoying. And I think that the other thing is that people don't really understand what a spectrum is. So they think of it as a continuum. They think of it as a line. And so here you've got very autistic and here you've got not autistic at all. And we all sit somewhere along that. But a spectrum is like the circly wheel of death you get on your Mac where, you know, where it spins around and you get those little, or like a pie chart, or like the Trivial Pursuit thing. And in one bit you'll have communication difficulties, in another bit you'll have sensory difficulties, in another bit you'll have, you know, something else and something else and something else, and all autistic people will be able to kind of pinpoint where they sit. But also it's about the level of difficulty that you have. So yeah, somebody might, my husband had lots of sensory issues, particularly around sound. And he's not autistic, but he really struggles with being in environments where he can't pick out the people that are talking to him and everything else is too loud around him. But that doesn't make him autistic. That makes him somebody who has a problem with sound. And I think that, and I think it sort of, I just think it's not good for anyone, for everyone to believe that. It's good for everyone to believe that we all live in the same world and we all have the same human experiences, but it is just a bit devaluing of the struggles and the achievements of autistic people if you just think, oh well, we're all a bit like that.
All right, well, next question on the list is don't say that you are autistic, you have autism.
Oh, for God's sake. I think everybody has the right to identify however they want to identify. And often, and I will always describe myself as somebody who's autistic, like I would always describe myself as somebody who is a mother or a brunette or whatever, because I'm not a person with motherness or a person with brown hairness or whatever. For me, my autism is an integral part of who I am. Equally, I speak to a lot of parents of children, and they feel very strongly that they want to say that their child has autism rather than is autistic, because they feel like you're kind of writing the child off or whatever. And I think that, and I think I have sympathy with both of, I think I have sympathy with the parents' view like that. And so I will always refer to somebody in the way that they want to be referred to. But I do find it annoying when somebody tells me how I should identify myself.
Yes, and I'm not sure actually why it is so either or, because being and having are, like I am a sister, I have a brother, yeah. I am this, I have that, you can say this for your job, you can say this for any relationship you can think of. Maybe it stops at my other conditions, but I always think it's a bit strange when people say that as well, because when I say I am autistic, I'm saying I am autistic. I didn't say I am an autism.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think it's about respecting what people want to say about themselves. So if you say to somebody I am autistic and they say don't say that, then that's like a bit like them saying I'm Jane and you're like, don't say that, say you're Danielle instead. I mean,
yeah,
there's no logic to it.
Or if someone got married, actually this person had actually recently got married, and I thought, how would you respond if I said, oh, don't define yourself by your marriage and your husband, and then insisted in using her old name?
Yeah, exactly.
Or calling her Ms instead of Mrs. Okay, so the last one on the list is so this is a rough kind of gist of what the person meant. So that other person is more weird and awkward to talk to you than you, so they must be more autistic.
So somebody told me something once, I'm trying to remember it so I say it accurately for everybody, but it's someone who says people say your autism isn't very severe, and the other person said, no, you're not experiencing my autism very severely. And I think it is, and I think that is what it is. You know, if somebody's difficult to talk to, that might just be because they're a difficult person to talk to. They might not be a very nice person. It might have nothing to do with the thing. Some of us, and I think this comes with age and experience as well, can make sure we make people feel comfortable when we're talking to them. Some of us don't have that talent, but that's not down to being autistic or not. You know, we've all worked with people who aren't autistic who make us feel terrible every time they open their mouths, but you know, we don't call them severely neurotypical or say neurotypicalness is more severe. We just say he's a bit of a nightmare.
It's also kind of defining autism in relationship to how neurotypical people experience us. So they experience the social awkwardness. They don't experience my sensory issues.
Exactly.
So, and when we talk about it as a spectrum, we're not talking about social awkwardness as a spectrum. We're saying there's more traits than just that, and some of them they are my private ones that you don't even know I'm kind of having or processing. But also I look at some of my autistic friends who you know, quite noticeably do have problems maintaining a conversation, but they are doing things that I really struggle to do. You know, like they go into town where when I can barely get on a bus. You know, they've gone through school, college, university, whereas I wasn't able to. Well, I managed to do one GCSE at home, but I didn't get further than that. You know, so they are doing other things as well. You can't just define someone by how they socially interact and make you feel.
Totally true. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's kind of like the things people do wrong. But how would you say people can get things right, especially like in a WI context? If you want to make a WI meeting autism friendly, what would you recommend that people do?
So I think it's the same with everything. I mean, you know, we talk a lot about differences that people have in all sorts of different ways. We talk about, you know, kind of ethnicities, we talk about gender, we talk about sexuality, we talk about neurodiversity, we talk about all of these things. And I think by and large, people want to be understood. And so I think if you meet someone and they say, I'm autistic, I have ADHD, I'm, you know, whatever, I'm a religion you've never heard of, I have this disability, I have whatever, you know, whatever, then I think most people kind of really appreciate being politely asked a question. So rather than saying you don't look autistic or whatever, how is that experience for you? Well, what is being autistic to you? And ask them the question. You'll learn about them, and you know, and they'll ask you questions in return, and that's just how you build relationships. But I think it's kind of not treating it like it's something that has to be kind of hushed up. I think one of the things that's quite interesting is that we are willing to talk about all sorts of really kind of things that we would never have discussed before, you know, kind of sex, religion, politics, all of those things that we would, you know, never discuss at a polite dinner party, that we're now very comfortable talking about in an open arena. But I think sometimes when you mention something like autism or a physical disability or something else, people just kind of clam up and they're like, don't talk about that, don't talk about that. And I just think, well, yeah, we would just want to be seen, really, don't we?
And then there's the obvious sensory things like quieter, darker space that people could go into, make it known that people are welcome to go into those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, yeah, absolutely. And also, so I didn't grow up with any of those accommodations. And I think one of the things that I've learned to do is accommodate myself in those ways. So like if I booked a cinema ticket, for example, when we used to be allowed out, I would always book an aisle seat. I would always make sure I could leave if I needed to or wanted to without disturbing other people and things like that. So when I hear about accommodations being made, then I always find it utterly thrilling that, you know, somebody else thought about it.
Well, we're coming up to past, so I wonder if anyone listening has questions, and you can unmute your microphone as well. Alison, you've got your hand up if you want to unmute. You will be recorded, the audio will be recorded, so if you don't want that, you can use the text chat, but if you're happy with your voice being on the recording, you can unmute.
Myself and a number of other women within the WI are, right as we speak, busy writing a resolution with the idea of getting it to conference in 2022 about underdiagnosis of both ASD and ADHD. We're making the points that people with these conditions will have less likely to be in full-time employment. They're more likely to be diagnosed with mental health conditions. In fact, a lot of us have been misdiagnosed for years. We all know that. That they're overrepresented in the prison population, which I didn't know, but one of the national trustees pointed that one out to me. And they do have shorter life expectancy. Because of these things, I thought, right, it's about time that we sort of looked at all the legislation and all the guidance, and I don't know if you've read the guidance. It goes on and on and on and on. It's got 24 bullet points at one point, and that women's presentation is different comes in at bullet point 23. It just... So, like I say, we're putting together this presentation, this resolution, and I'm going to be ready to send it up to my federation at the end of July. I'm hoping, I think there's a couple of other people on here that are going to send it to their federation. I'd love it if people want to come on board and get behind it.
Yeah, that's really good that could happen, and maybe you can talk to your WIs about autism and women in advance, so they've kind of got it in their heads.
We've got some skilled speakers already lined up. I mean, I'm not going to talk to my own WI because there are other WI members who are skilled speakers about this who are going to come and talk to my own WI. They know I'm autistic. They elected me president, and I said, "You do realise I'm autistic." Thank you very much for listening, everybody. I'll shut up again and let somebody else.
It's fascinating.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah. Well, I think that will be really good if that could happen, because I think the WI is quite a good place for autistic women to come, because there's a lot of structure, and you can nominate your special interest as a subject of a subgroup, and that's pretty good if that happens.
Hi Rosa, can I ask a question? I don't have a photograph up, I'm afraid, so I can't put my hand up. It's Anna, my name's Anna. Right. I'm the mother of an autistic child, and just wanted to ask Laura a little bit about, she spoke about specialist therapists that she received when she received her diagnosis. I just wondered if she could expand on those a bit. I understand a little bit about the therapies that children get, but not so much with adults. And also, I just wondered if she'd give us a little bit of insight onto how being autistic can affect motherhood. Does it, like you mentioned, you had one of your children was autistic. I don't know if your others are. The pros and cons for both, really, because it's almost like the opposite to what I have. I do have quite a lot of understanding of autism. I worked as a teacher with a lot of autistic children, so I was very quick on the, from the start. I could tell, I could read the signs, and we got our son diagnosed very young. But I just wondered, what it was like the other way around.
Okay, so the therapy I had was cognitive analytical therapy, CAT, which I think is less common than CBT, and I think CBT doesn't work so well with autistic people as it does with neurotypical people generally. Mm-hmm. And for me, a lot of it was incredibly practical. A lot of it was about putting in about teeth. I'm incredibly scatty. I don't remember to brush my teeth in the morning. I wouldn't remember to eat. There's lots of stuff that there's lots of adulting that I haven't got my head around, even at the hugely old age that I currently am. So a lot of it was about that. A lot of it was also coming to terms with the fact that I had I had this huge diagnosis, but I'd also had these other physical health diagnoses, and I've had a lot of trauma in my life as well. So it was all around that. So I don't know how much that relates to a child. Mm-hmm. But I think, once they get into teenage years, if they have any issues that are more than just autism, then I think that cognitive analytical therapy is really, really helpful. Right. So my children are neurodivergent. None of them has an autism diagnosis, but equally none of them would describe themselves as neurotypical, I don't think. And one of them very recently had an ADHD diagnosis, but he also has kind of quite a lot of autistic traits. But again, they have all come to this in adulthood, because I was very young when I had them.
I was going to say, can't possibly have grown-up children.
Oh, well, they're 30s. That's very kind. My husband is.
Oh my gosh.
He does my lighting, so really, honestly, 100 years older than I really look here.
Oh, I need him here.
And motherhood. So I think it's really interesting, because I think that yes, I think that kind of one's neurotype probably does affect how one parents, but also I think our childhood affects how we parent as well. And my childhood was incredibly un-autistic friendly. I was adopted into quite a chaotic family. There was quite a lot of trauma. I never felt safe. There were lots of issues around food. It was a very difficult childhood. My mother had mental health problems. She was constantly being hospitalized at a time when mental health institutions were really quite terrifying places to be. I mean, they weren't that dissimilar to Victorian asylums. So there was a lot going on. And I think that I found being a child really, really difficult. So I tried to make my children's childhood really magical. And I tried to, I tried to allow them to do whatever they wanted to do. Was that a good thing? I don't know. I mean, if my kids got up in the morning and said, I don't want to go to school today, I'd say, okay, fine, don't go to school. And because we lived in a big house, and because I am quite confident, and because I speak with a plummy accent, nobody ever said anything. So one of my kids probably went to school about a third of the time he was meant to be there. And looking back, I was very young, and looking back, that probably isn't what I would do now. Now I would get them assessed for their various neurodivergences and give them more support at school.
I was just going to say, for a child who may be struggling in school, is that necessarily a bad thing?
Well, I don't know. I
mean,
who knows? I mean, I don't know. I mean, they've all gone on to, do their own thing. They're all very confident. And we have an incredibly honest relationship. There's nothing that they wouldn't tell me. And I spent my whole teenage years lying to my mother about everything from, where I was to what I'd eaten to everything.
Sounds perfectly normal to me.
Yeah. So I don't know, but I think that, I think that one of the things that I was able to do as somebody neurodivergent is understand my children's understand my children's experience of the sensory world. So, for example, my parents used to tell a story about how I had a yellow coat and a blue coat. They were exactly the same brand. Everything was the same about them. I would happily wear the blue one, but I wouldn't wear the yellow one, or the other way around. I can't remember. So I would get sort of smacked or told off or whatever for it. And whereas with my children, I would be, what is it about the blue one you don't like? And then if it's the label scratch, you take the label out, So I think being able to, I think that I was lucky that I was able to kind of to understand, because I was quite young as well, so it wasn't that long ago that I'd experienced childhood. I think I was able to understand that lack of agency and try and give them some agency. I gave them too much.
Oh, lovely. Well, thank you very much. And just on a funny side, my husband is autistic as well, and I did once say, does my bum look big in this? And I really wish I hadn't asked. It's almost the opposite to you. Yes, it does, he says, but that's because your bum is big. It works both ways, doesn't it? Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was good. You mentioning about therapies reminded me what the difference is between a disability like autism and EDS and POTS, because in my opinion, if I got rid of my EDS and POTS, that would be great. But autism is a little bit more fuzzy and complicated. So could you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, okay. If I could get rid of my EDS and POTS, I would click my fingers and do it immediately, because they're really, apart from being quite good at yoga, there are no upsides to that. Autism is difficult, and it's really different. And I think that in the way that the world has become very polarized on every single subject at the moment, I think that that on one hand, you get people who say everything about autism is wonderful, it's just the outside world that's terrible, and therefore, talks of cures are really, really dreadful and blah, blah, blah. And then on the other side, you've got people saying autism is like a blight on humanity, we must get rid of all autistic people, we must never let it happen again. And I think that the truth is, the way I've experienced my autism is there have been times in my life where if I could have waved a magic wand and have been like everybody else, I would have waved that magic wand. Many of those times have been when I was younger. And I think that most young people struggle with identity, struggle with difference, and struggle with things at some point in their life. And if they could have waved a magic wand to make them not the person they were, then they would have done that. But now I'm able to see that my autism comes with real benefits. Work-wise, it's brilliant for me. That ability to hyper-focus, that ability to kind of pattern spot, all of those things is amazing. I think, at the risk of sounding a bit spoiled and selfish, I'd quite like to be able to do a bit of pick and mix. I would like to be able to go out, and I've never been on a girls' night out, ever. Never been out with a group of women because I would find it too noisy and too chaotic and too confusing. But sometimes I'll walk past, a really beautiful pub or a really beautiful restaurant, and you've got these women who obviously have this really strong friendship sitting there and enjoying themselves. And if I could wave a magic wand and get rid of my sensory issues at that point, I definitely would. But on balance, if it was a black and white yes or no, then I would still choose to be autistic.
I know what you mean. It's the very specific situations where you think, oh, if I could get on a bus and not feel incredibly stressed and incredibly tense, or if I got the taxi and not have to worry if it smelled before I got to where I was going, if I could not have those specific things, that would be great. But with an illness, whether it's like the physical ones we're talking about or a mental illness like depression or anxiety, they don't have good bits about them or neutral bits about them. They are by definition bad. You don't want them. You don't feel that there's anything good about having a migraine in any way. Whereas with autism, there are strengths.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, the only physical disabilities I can really speak about are ADS and POTS because I experienced them, and I can't see an upside to them, and I've never met anybody else who can. In terms of mental illness, it's interesting because my husband, I've written about this, has suffered from mental illnesses in the past, and he took some medication, and he said that it totally took away his creativity, and so he actually feels similarly to the way that many autistic people feel about it giving them something, and he talks about that light and shade that you get if you suffer from severe depression, for example, and it really sparking creativity. So I haven't really experienced mental illness, so I can't really talk about it, but certainly EDS and POTS, take it away tomorrow, please. Thank you.
Yeah, whereas autism, like your quote, is about creating the environment. Whereas if you change my environment, I'd be able to cope with my illnesses better, things would be improved, but basically get rid of the illness.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
Does anyone else have any questions? We'll say goodbye quite soon, I think, because it's coming up to 1:45. But I don't want to leave anyone out if you've got something burning that you'd like to add. There's like 3 pages of webcam people. I'm just trying to flick through, so you can just turn your microphone on because I can't see everyone.
Oh, somebody's just said there's a question above in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let me just trying to find it. There's quite a lot of comments. Can you?
Yeah, it's from Philida. And it says, I have a question for Laura. Do you have any advice for autistic people working in a not stereotypically autistic field? I work in charity communications, and I'm really worried about disclosing my diagnosis to my company because of stereotypes. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think it depends on lots of things, how long you've been there, whether they know how well that you do your job already, what the benefit of disclosing it to them would be. Would you be getting different accommodations, all of those kind of things. And I have really never had a proper job where I wasn't working for myself. But I do, I, as well as being an autism journalist, I do own a communications agency, and I was very nervous about about telling my clients about my autism, because I work with some quite big brands, and I thought about the stereotypes too, and I thought maybe they would see me differently, and I felt all of those feelings. And in the end, I wrote a coming out piece for the Telegraph so everybody saw it all at once. And I have to say, everybody was brilliant, like totally asked great questions, really understanding, didn't get any negative comments or anything from anyone I knew. So I guess if you feel that you would get something out of telling people, and you work with a team that you can understand, then I would just raise it really gently and just start talking about autism generally and then bring it up. But I'm not the person to ask about workplaces, because I haven't really had one.
And would you sort of apply that to telling anyone in general?
I think, so I was going to tell people one by one. And then in the end just decided to write this piece, because it meant that I could say everything I wanted to say uninterrupted. I think it's like coming out with anything. I was telling you before we came on here that when I was thinking about how I was going to tell everyone about my autism, I spoke to a friend of mine who came out as gay in the 1980s, and he was really interesting on it. He was just like, oh, some people will say, oh, for God's sake, why do we need to know this about you? Just looking for attention. And other people would be like, yeah, well, we always knew. And other people would be like, oh, great, and just move on to the next thing. And I was very nervous about telling my children, and I kind of psyched myself up for it. And they were sitting at the kitchen table. It's when they both just come home from college. And it was just the boys at home then, and they were making toast, and I just kind of went, so yeah, I went to see a psychiatrist and I've got an autism diagnosis. And there was like a moment's silence, and then one of them said, oh, can we go count cards in Vegas? Haha. And then the other one didn't say anything, and I thought, oh my God, I've traumatized this child, it's all terrible. And he just went, oh, okay, what's for supper? And I realized he'd just been looking at his screen and wasn't really, totally unbothered, and they've never been bothered since. So I guess, I think that the thing I would say is make sure you're in a strong position when you decide to tell people. Just make sure you're really grounded and you're really happy, and you've really come to terms with it yourself, unless you feel that there are people who are going to be really supportive and really nourishing and really helpful in coming to terms with the diagnosis yourself.
So Naomi, you said in the comments that you have something you'd like to say.
Mute myself.
Hi.
Hello. I'm going to struggle how to say this without sounding like a stalker, but I just have a really quick story, which is for Laura. So it's really strange how I found myself on this webinar tonight, but Laura's was one of the first books I read a couple of years ago when I first had my light bulb moment, and I felt like she was the first person I'd found that was like me, so actually a good communicator and not kind of typically autistic. And then randomly about a year ago, Laura popped up on my friend's Facebook page, and I sent her a message to say, oh my God, I love your book, I've read it, I'm on a pathway for diagnosis. And then last week I got my diagnosis, and then like the next day this popped up. So I just kind of feel like things have come full circle.
Congratulations.
Yeah, and I think we're really lucky that's what we find. So I got my EDS diagnosis because I got sent a review copy of Ella Woodward, Deliciously Ella's book, and in the press release, it had this illness. And so I googled the illness, and suddenly I thought, and I looked at the symptoms, and I thought, well, I thought that was normal, I thought that was normal, I thought that was normal, and that's how I and then I messaged her and then went to one of her cookery courses, and exactly like you, I was like, oh my God, am I being a stalker? But I don't think that is the case. I did reply to you, didn't I? I get hundreds of messages, and sometimes they go into a junk folder, but I did reply. Yeah, good. Yeah. And she replied to me, and I think I think as women, that's what we can all do. I think we can be that really supportive community for each other.
Yeah, it's the finding people who are like you thing again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rach, you have your little hand icon up. Did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say I got diagnosed like 2 years ago with autism, although I already knew long before then. It was an absolute fight to get a diagnosis because I'm also registered blind. So everything just got shoved down to that, and it was like, right. And because I also have epilepsy and cerebral palsy as well, so it's just like a multitude of different disabilities. So it all just got shoved into one box, and it's really annoying.
Yeah, I think especially when you are autistic, you're the kind of person who, well, again, we're all different, but I do think autistic people tend to like to make sense of things.
Oh, without a doubt.
So when you're faced with a system that is kind of blocking your way to make sense and make connections and join the dots, and instead just wants you to sort of attribute things to something very general, that is incredibly frustrating.
I recognised your voice, not Laura.
Yes.
Okay, I recognise your voice from somewhere, and I don't know why.
Oh, okay. Well, I do quite a lot of TV stuff. I talk about autism a lot. I've done a lot of radio stuff. So
was it on that ITV morning show?
I've done This Morning and Lorraine and
Lorraine, that was it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
No, it's nice to meet you. It's nice to talk to people that actually understand, like, it really how frustrating it is.
Yeah,
because people just go, no, you can't be autistic, because like the amount of people that have said to me, I can't be autistic because like lots of
you like the wrong things to be autistic.
Yeah, I think we've all had that. Yeah.
Oh, it's constant. I'm like,
It's very lovely to meet you.
It's so nice to meet you. Thank you for letting me come up and speak. I'm gonna have to go now, but yeah, but it'd be nice to talk to you guys again, if possible.
Yes, well, I'm just going to mute you for a second, because on that note, because I have read the book and I thought it was great, and I thought if there's enough people interested, would anyone be interested in doing a kind of mini book group on Laura's book, where I've already got a few people interested. Okay, we've got one thumbs up. If you can wave thumbs up when we can get together. Okay, yeah. Okay, so there's enough people, so I will organize that and I'll put the word out in the places that I advertise this, and we can get back together, talk about the book. And if you haven't read it, I find reading really difficult, because this is one of my interests. I was able to read it, but but if you haven't read it or you can't read it, you can still come and hear us talk about it and come and ask questions and so on. Oh, Liz, you've got your hand up. Is that a question?
Yeah, I read it really soon after it first came out, and I have recommended it to so many people. To be honest, it reads like a novel. It's a really easy read. It's not like, massive textbooks that we sometimes read for research and stuff like that. It gives you an enormous amount of information that you might get from a textbook, and yet at the same time it's actually like reading a novel, I thought. And I have recommended it to a lot of people, and I would do so again now.
Oh, that's really kind. Thank you.
Yes, when I posted in the different groups to say that we'd be talking to you, Laura, the amount of people who said that you gave them their revelation that made autism make sense to them and put it into a context, that was just really helpful. That came up over and over again because of your book.
That's really lovely. Yeah, I mean, I wrote it for that kind of reason, really. I wrote it because I didn't, at that point, I hadn't found anyone like me. As I said before, I think I said before that there are lots of other really great memoirs now by autistic women, but at the time there just really wasn't anything that I could find that spoke to me. So yeah, so it's thrilling to hear that, and thank you.
And I think because this is a topic that had a lot of interest, I will see who else I can get to come and talk about it, and we'll revisit it. And ADHD as well, and Laura, if you want to come back, you can come back for another round. But I will organize the book group, and someone put in the chat it's on Audible as well.
Oh, it is. It's read by the really brilliant Helen from The Archers, which is because I can't read out loud, so I didn't do it myself. It's great. So yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. This was such an enjoyable chat, and I'm going to be sending it to my dad and my cousins.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, and I'll keep in touch. And thank you everyone for coming. And if you have more questions, you can send me a message on Facebook, and we can either put it forward to like the book group discussion or to our next speaker, and I'll let you know what else we're going to be doing. That was the end of the podcast. Thank you so much to everyone who came and listened and asked questions, and especially thank you so much to Laura James. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I'm looking forward to the next podcast.